Dr. Rami Halaseh, there's a tradition that the famous Qur'an manuscript that you analyze in depth in your scholarship, called the Topkapi Manuscript, it actually has the blood of the third
Hmm.
caliph that can still be seen in the manuscript because he was murdered while reading from, this is Uthman, he was murdered from reading this very manuscript. What do you make of this story, and was it on your mind as you were studying the manuscript?
Absolutely, that's absolutely right, and that was one of the reasons why I started studying this manuscript. Is the fact that there's a tradition that when people came into Uthman and they killed him, first they cut his hand, and some of the blood from his hand fell on verse in chapter number 2, verse 137. فَسَيَكْفِيكُمُ اللَّهُ. And people say that you can see those bloodstains on this particular manuscript on page 21 in the manuscript. So that was actually the reason why I started studying this manuscript, and it's kind of I
Mm.
fell in love with it, and the rest is history from there.
Yeah, so it has this dramatic kind of origin story to this manuscript. And
Absolutely.
one could think that because of that, it's more than just, I don't know, a resource for better understanding the text, but at least in popular understanding, it has like this pious, it's connected to the pious story of a caliph and a companion of Muhammad. Friends, we're going to, in this episode, we're going to speak in depth about Quran manuscripts. Why do manuscripts matter? There's a lot of tradition in Islam that the Quran was transmitted
Mhm.
orally, but then we have all these manuscripts, right, that were transmitted. Dr. Halaseh has studied these in depth. I'll give a brief introduction, and then we're going to speak kind of generally about this question of manuscripts, variants, but also in particular about this extraordinary manuscript that he's recently published on the Topkapi manuscript. So, friends, Rami Halaseh works on the development of qira'at or readings, um, maybe variants. That's probably a question for us to discuss. Is qira'at readings or variants? What's the right English term
That's
for
right.
that? In Quranic manuscripts. He completed his PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and he completed a postdoctoral work at Harvard University. And the work we're speaking about, the recent publication, is entitled the Topkapi Qur'an Manuscript HS32 History, Text,
Mhm.
and Variants. Just out in 2024. We're recording this in 2024, so just out with De Gruyter. One of the most famous publishing houses for Islamic studies and Quranic studies in particular. Why don't we start with that question of readings or variants? And maybe you could tell us which way is better to translate the Arabic word qira'at. And then generally, there's a lot of kind of buzz around this word variance, lots of back and
Mhm.
forth on the internet about this. So could you just kind of introduce us a little bit to, what does qira'at really mean, and why are people so interested in the question of variance?
Yeah, thank you. That's really a great question, and that's a good place to start this conversation. I really think that those conversations should start with when you talk about the development and the transmission of the Quranic text.
Mhm.
We should use the term qira'ah rather than variant. Now, the word qira'ah, as you said, means reading simply in Arabic, rather.
Mhm.
So rather than variant, even that I myself use variant very often and when I talk. And the reason why I prefer to use the word qira'ah is not only because classical Islamic sources use this term, but more importantly, because using the term variant implies the existence of an original text of the
Ah,
Quran,
okay.
right?
Something that you
And
can sort of vary from, or that's the right word, depart
exactly,
from. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, so it
Yeah,
assumes
they
that.
assume,
Mhm.
exactly, they assume that there was at some point a single original text from which these readings have deviated, which
Yes.
is historically an accurate representation of how the Quran originally developed. Now, the term variant, I think it was likely adopted from the field of New Testament textual criticism, where
Okay.
scholars often try to reconstruct an original text of the New Testament. However, the case for the Quran is a little bit different. Reading literary sources, I would say that they don't suggest that Muslim scholars were taught or even thought of an original text. This is why we should not attempt to recover some kind of an ur-text of the Quran from which these variants evolved or mutated, right?
Okay. Right.
So
Yes.
even the Masahif today, with all the
So
7
the
or 10 or
codices.
13.
Yeah.
No. I'm talking about
Just
the
actual
different
copies
eponymous, yes,
Mhm.
the eponymous readers that we have in the Masahif today, and circulating among lay people. They cannot be in any way, shape, or form considered to be some kind of an ur-text as well
Okay.
of the Quran.
Okay. Let me turn back to the important point you made about the term variance and possibly its origin in New Testament scholarship. It is the key difference there that when we're dealing with Greek, New Testament is written in Greek, both the vowels and consonants are written in the Greek script. There's probably some variability there because I know there are accents and things, but basically the Greek script tells you what these words are. Whereas with the Quran, the nature of, I don't know if archaic is the right word, but the script in Arabic of Quran manuscripts, it's fundamentally different. Is that the key point there?
Yes, absolutely. It is definitely different than it is in Greek. And again, when we talk about the Greek manuscripts, which ones are we talking about? The capital letters or the small letters? Which phase they are? But I think I have come to be convinced that an unbiased reading in literary sources reveals that the same verse in the Quran, because how Arabic was written and the defective Arabic and the absence of vowels in a big part in the beginning, the same word can be read in so many different ways, and those variations or those words or those different readings, I would say, they differ in short vowels, long vowels, individual consonants, and sometimes in entire words or phrases. Now, if you go to the Encyclopedia of the Readings of the Quran, which is a database that has been published, it's Quran.org. You will see all the texts of the Quran, and they have so many different variants for each word. And I would like to give like one example just for people to be able to understand this and understand when we say the words differ or the readings differ from each other. We said they can differ in vowels, they can differ in consonants and or more. For example, off the top of my head, the Hafs an Asim reads chapter or Surah 14, verse 42, تحسبن, while Nafi' and Ibn Kathir read it تحسبن. Now, the difference between those two, and تحسبن is actually what we find in HS32. Now, the difference in those two is the manuscript
that your book is on.
Absolutely. So the difference in this is just تحسبن, تحسبن, فتحة, كسرة. So it's just a simple short vowel in that.
Just one little stroke in the Arabic script, right? Yeah.
It can be above the letter or below the letter. Now, some readings can be more complicated even. For example, the very famous example in Surah 57 and verse 24, where there's a whole personal pronoun, huwa, which means he. They differ. The two readings differ. So, for example, the reading of Hafs an Asim reads huwa al-ghaniyu al-hamid, including the personal pronoun huwa, while in contrast, Nafi' and Ibn Amir and I think Abu Ja'far as well read al-ghaniyu al-hamid without huwa. Now, this reflects more regional variation in the Masahif.
If you don't mind, Dr. Rami, if I can circle back just to sort of work things out a bit further, especially because the good and the bad of exploring the Quran and the Bible is we have folks who come in sort of principally biblical interests or may not be experts in either Quranic or biblical studies, so they may not be familiar about one, the nature of the Arabic script, which is hard to do in a podcast where we're just chatting. So we may not go into depth about that. But then two, kind of the story, the traditional story of how the Quran came to be as a book, like not a heavenly book, but terrestrial book. So, I mean, just
Mhm.
important to note that folks may hear especially in chatter on the internet that oh, the Quran, there's just one Quran. If you go to any bookstore, you find the same Arabic text. The story of how that text came to be is very complicated, passes over centuries. So let's just start at the beginning with that, if it's okay. So,
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
yeah, for example, I mean, we already mentioned Uthman, the third caliph.
Uh-huh. That's right.
The tradition is that he's responsible for at least the basic Quranic text that more or less is
Mhm.
universal today. But could you comment a little bit on those accounts? It comes up in your
Yeah,
book of texts that actually existed before Uthman. Some attributed to figures like Ibn Mas'ud and Ubay, but even Ali, so the
that's
cousin of
right.
the
That's
Prophet,
right.
I said to have in some traditions. So could you speak about those stories? Are they just
Yeah,
stories, or do you
absolutely.
think those versions existed before Uthman's version?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the traditional story, and still there's so much debate and discussion over that, is that actually the third Caliph Uthman, um, because of differences in reading the Quran in the Amsar, he was worried that the Quran would be corrupted and people will keep disagreeing on that. So he decided to produce, if you will, Textus Receptus
Hmm.
of the Quran,
An
just a
official
standardized
version, or
text, official version.
hmm
So he forced a committee or formed a committee,
hmm
and those are people related to him. He excluded all the senior companions from this committee, and he produced what we call today the Uthmanic text type. Right? It's the kind of standard mushaf that he thought that this is the authorized one, and he made most accounts, they say he made four copies of it. One sent to Basra, Kufa, Syria, and one remained in Medina. Other accounts they add Yemen and Bahrain as well to those cities. And from there, the belief is that all those actually four, if you wish, four codices, they match exactly. Now historical accounts tell us that other companions of the prophet, that they were well versed in the Quran and well versed in the in reciting this Quran, had their own codices. So we have Ibn Mas'ud, we have Ubay bin Ka'b. Those are the two famous ones. And there are some accounts for Ali, actually, that Ali ibn Abi Talib, after the death of Muhammad, he said that I will not leave the house until I collect, or ajma' al-Quran, they say. Then they start saying, well, what does ajma' mean? Is it
Yeah.
memorize or actually collect the Quran? Some sources, they say that he collected the Quran, presented it to Abu Bakr, yet Abu Bakr rejected his recension and collection. Um, and what we are looking at right now, when we talk about the Quranic text, we are talking about the Uthmanic text style. Now, that being said, even attributing this collection to Uthman is still a topic of hot debate. Recently a book came out on the Quran that suggested and argued very effectively that it was actually after Uthman's time that the Quran was put together. The details of this story really makes it, for me at least, still very questionable if it's actually Uthman who did it or somebody else. Now, the question that you asked, do I think that it was actually Ibn Mas'ud, and did they actually have their
hmm
own
hmm Are these
codices?
just stories?
And
Are these just legends? Or at
yes,
once
yeah,
upon a
yeah,
time, did they really exist, these manuscripts? Because we don't
yeah.
have them,
So
right?
I
I mean,
think,
it's worth stating, sorry, Rami, if you don't mind,
yeah, no, go
it's
for it.
worth stating that we don't have them, right? You cannot find a manuscript that is
Yeah,
Ibn Mas'ud's manuscript or Ali's manuscript. They don't exist in 2024. So did they once exist?
yeah. So I think there's a reason why we don't have them. I do think that they did exist, and
Hmm.
I will present you with three quick reasons why I think they did exist. But before that, when Uthman, the tradition says, when Uthman collected the Masahif, he
Hmm.
or he presented his own official codex. he ordered to all the copies and manuscripts of the Quran to be collected. And some accounts, they say that he burned them, others that he أغرقهم, he drowned them, right? And there seems to be a systematic approach to suppress any text type that differed from Uthman. So it does make sense why we don't find those days. And even among those codices, we read that they differ not only in the readings, but even in the number of chapters. So, for example, we have Ibn Mas'ud. Now, the text type we have today is 114 surahs, as you know. Now, Ibn Mas'ud, he rejected the accounts. They say that he rejected 3 surahs. He rejected the Fatiha and the Mu'awwidhadain, al-Falaq and-Nas.
The last two, exactly. Just by numbers, 113,
yeah, so
1, and then 113,
exactly,
114.
And 114. While Ubay bin Ka'b, they say that he had 2 more surahs, which is Al-Hafd and Khali', so totaling 116. So the way I think about it is that we have 111, we have 114, and we have 116. So it's like Uthman took in the middle, right? He wanted to take the middle ground. So do I think they exist? I do, and I think there are 3 important reasons to keep in mind. And we really have to be kind of almost blind to ignore those facts. First, we not only have reports that those codices actually exist, but we have multiple interesting accounts of a systematic and what might be viewed as a state-sponsored attempt to suppress Ibn Mas'ud's tradition. For instance, the account of the Umayyad governor, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, we read that he held a very strong hatred towards the reading of Ibn Mas'ud, and he even, and you know that, he called his Mus'haf Rajasul A'rab, the poetry of the Bedouin, right? And he labeled Ibn Mas'ud Ra's al-Munafiqeen, the chief of the hypocrites, which is really major when you think about it. You know, and Al-Hajjaj, he went to the extent, and I remember reading this for the first time many years ago, and I was just blown away. Al-Hajjaj went to the extent of not only prohibiting the recitation of the Quran in the Ibn Mas'ud reading in Kufa, but he went to the extent to threatening people to kill them if he caught them reciting it. And he said that he will remove and eliminate the reading of Ibn Mas'ud, even if that meant using a rib of a swine.
Yes,
so
I remember.
The reports, the reports did
to erase it,
indeed,
like actually to erase the
exactly, to erase it from the parchment.
I mean,
and that's,
and obviously, just to jump in, I mean, symbolically important, right? Because the Mus'haf should be a sacred object, and
sacred, that's right.
anything from a pig would be considered impure.
Absolutely.
But I remember
and I think
there are accounts actually. I mean, whether it actually happened, I don't know. But there really are accounts of folks accused of reciting something in their ritual prayer, right? According to Ibn Mas'ud's text type.
Absolutely.
Getting imprisoned, tortured. So, but your
killed.
point is all of these accounts, the only maybe explanation for their presence in different books today is that there really was this was a threat. Ibn Mas'ud's version was
a threat. That's right.
Another a threat. Maybe Al-Hajjaj, maybe others felt like for political reasons we just can't have any disagreement over the text.
Yes, well, maybe that's the motivation. I agree with you, but the fact that the question is, did they exist? And this will point to that if they did exist. Let me give you two more reasons why I really think that those codices actually exist. Now, we see in the early compilers of the Qur'an often reported to have consulted companions, masahif companions, in their pursuit of creating their works. And one of them is the very famous Abu Ja'far al-Tabari, who said that he actually, as he was investigating, I think, chapter 5, I think either verse 90 or 89, and he said that he saw it in the Masahif of Ubay bin Ka'b and Ibn Mas'ud, and he said that they contain the word mutatabi'at. So I would say that would be Surah 5, verse 89.
The CE date, Abu Ja'far al-Tabari dies, I think, in 923. So, I mean, if you trust him, and depending how we read this, So sometime around the year 900, he could have still picked up one of those versions and read
Exactly, it's one of
it.
those. And the third clue, I think, and that's where I get a little bit more excited because it has to do with manuscripts. The third clue is the fact that all manuscripts we have today actually come from the Ottomanic text type, or belong, sorry, to the Ottomanic text type. We have one very interesting manuscript that seems
Yeah.
to deviate substantially from this one. This manuscript is the Sana'a palimpsest, DAM 0, I think 0127.1, and the studies have been, multiple studies have been done on that, and obviously I'm referring to the lower text, right? So it's a palimpsest. So I'm
Yeah.
referring to the
So can I
lower
just
text of it.
explain? Is it okay,
Yes,
Rami? I just
absolutely,
give a detail
absolutely.
or two.
Yes.
So in the early 1970s, folks are doing some repairs on a ceiling in a mosque in Sana'a, in Yemen, country of Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
They discovered sort of a repository of old Quran folios where they were kind of in a attentive way to respect the text. They were stored after they no longer could be used, and among the parchments found there was one that had two layers of writing. So people wrote on top of earlier writing, and through different technologies, when folks were able to read the lower text of this palimpsest, so that means the two-layered
Mm-hmm.
version of a manuscript, when they were able to read the lower text, they found it's not the text type of Uthman. So, and it's the
Exactly.
only one, I think,
That's right.
that we have. So, and you're saying like its discovery, even though it doesn't actually match Ibn Masud or Ubay,
Exactly.
exactly,
It,
but it still kind of shows there were other text types around.
that's right. That's right. And so there's really, to me, there's no reason to argue that these codices did not really exist. It appears that they not only existed, but they were also used as the primary text by some people for a considerable time after
Mhm,
the death of Uthman
mhm.
and all the companions.
Yes. Okay. Great. All
Yeah.
right. Now, let's get to the big manuscript in question.
Yeah.
Again, Dr. Halaseh, his book is the Topkapi Qur'an manuscript, just published by De Gruyter. And can you tell us maybe just a little bit of the story, excuse me, about how you became interested in this manuscript in particular? I mean, you alluded to,
Yeah.
you had heard of the Othman legend, and you actually,
Mhm.
I think you mentioned, maybe it was when we spoke previously, not during our recording today, that there are kind of marks or something you can
Yeah,
actually
that's
see, and so you look at it, or you're like, wait, maybe this is the blood. Anyway, well, tell us the story. Well, why study this manuscript? Why invest so much time in working on this one manuscript?
Yeah, so that's interesting, and that will take me back a few. Now it's maybe a couple of decades back. In Before I got interested in pursuing textual criticism and manuscript, I was working as a veterinarian
Mhm.
in a in the desert, and I used to treat large animals. In the area where I lived in and I worked had a lot of ruins, and I got really interested in
Mm,
history and reading history, and this, among many other factors that played into this journey. I started exploring the manuscripts of the Quran. Back in the day when I first started, we did not have a lot of work being done on that, and I started working on this, or at least start reading, back in 2003 or 4. So the field was still very, very limited at that point. But every time I read something, they kept pointing to the Topkapi manuscript, right?
mm.
It kept talking to it over and over. Some people called it the original Quran. Some people say that it's the Quran that the Prophet himself had, back in his day, and others, they say that it's what Uthman was reading. One person, he said, in a book he wrote, that it was a copy from Mushaf al-Madini, so al-Mushaf al-Imam, a direct copy from Mushaf al-Imam. So everything and everybody kept pointing
Which
toward
means
the Kaaba.
the
The
basis
main,
the basis for the versions that were sent out, as you were saying earlier, to,
absolutely.
to Basra, Kufa, Syria.
Absolutely. So it's the main one. It's the one that Uthman
Mhm.
himself
Yeah.
himself had. So I went and I bought a facsimile edition, which is a photograph of the manuscript. itself. And I was surprised when I started looking, and it was just an enjoyable time. And the more I digged into it, the more I discovered that it's rich and it would be worth exploring. And that's how I started getting interested in that. And the legend, to be honest, the legend of Uthman, reading it while he was actually when he was killed,
Yeah,
that gave it even a more heavy
of
weight
course.
to me. And I know
Yeah,
that to
more
to
like,
most
yeah,
to most Muslims,
traumatic.
it is, yeah, it is a major thing. Imagine for a Christian, if you say that we found some artifacts from Saint Peter, or artifacts from Paul, so
Yeah,
that would carry really a heavy
of
weight.
course, of
So the
course.
same thing is like Uthman was reading it, and that was the beginning of my study of that. And yeah, after I finished my master's, I started working on it, and
And
it took
then
me
and then
until
in scholarly terms, sorry, forgive me for jumping in.
no,
First
it's
of all,
okay.
I've been saying Topkapi, but what's the correct pronunciation in Turkish here?
It's it's Topkapa,
Topkapa.
Topkapa.
Okay,
Yeah,
Topkapa. All
but
right.
you know what? Turks are very kind that
They're patient.
there's so much, yeah, there's so much grace there when
Yeah,
you say
yeah.
Topkapi.
Okay, so if there are any Turks in the comment section, be kind to me as well. Sorry for the mispronunciation. Yeah, so just in more sort of like scholarly terms, so there's a story about Uthman and all that, but actually, like for what this manuscript can tell us about the history of the Quranic text, I mean, on those grounds, is it indeed an important manuscript, and why?
I think it's very important, actually, manuscript. It's important not only because of its not because of its religious value and how people view it, but it's also a manuscript that contains 97.78 of the text of the Quran.
Hmm.
For a while, um, this was considered to be a first century manuscript, and a lot of people, they were pointing to it. Until just a few weeks ago, I saw a video of one imam. He was taking a tour through his mosque, and they had a facsimile edition of the manuscript, and he was showing them, and this is the original Quran from where
Mhm,
all current Qurans are taken. So I think
mhm,
it's first of all, it is important because of its value to
mhm,
Muslims and to the vast majority of people. And it's talking about a book that is revered as a holy book by so many people worldwide. Um, and the third thing, it is, as all manuscripts just magnificent um, artifacts, because they give us, they are like a window. You look back into history, and they give you all those pieces of evidence in front of you. You just have to follow the evidence and come up with a beautiful picture. It's like a puzzle. You collect the pieces here and there, and together you form one beautiful picture of history. So the religious reverence of the manuscript, its history, and the fact that nobody has done an extensive work on it in this capacity. There's
right,
a book
right.
published, a facsimile edition published on this manuscript a while ago in 2007, the first edition, I think, and 2019, the second edition. But it did not even go in depth as what I did in my book. So what I did in the book is primarily, I presented a holistic, which I hope to be a holistic and thorough approach to
Mhm.
studying this manuscript, not only examining it as a religious text, but also offering a kind of a comprehensive and systematic analysis of
And
the
when you say
manuscript as
analysis, do you mean principally differences, to avoid the term variance for now, but differences between, um, for example, the common text read today, the
no,
1924
actually.
Cairo text, and this, or yeah.
No, I go much further than that. What I do is I treat the manuscript on both as a textual evidence and as a physical artifact. Um,
Mhm,
so it's kind of a well-rounded methodological approach to its
mhm,
study. So I study its codicology, its paleography, its orthography. So the way that it's structured, like as a book, how it was
mhm, mhm,
put together as a book, and the
mhm.
paleography, how
Right, to
how it's
measure
yeah, the script, the
height
font,
and width of
exactly.
each folio, the
Eh,
margins, the all of the, yeah, nitty
exactly.
gritty.
And that took me so many days doing that. The orthography, how it's written, and the words, how they are written, and
Yes.
they're defective. There's an alif, there's no alif, hamza, no hamza. All those small details, even the short vowels, and I literally went through every single word in the manuscript and compared it in the fifth chapter. I compared it to the current text that we have, whether it is Hafs and Asim or all the other known known readings.
We have to circle back to Hafs and Asim and explain that for our viewers. But just a couple of nerdy questions about the manuscript itself. First of all, as far as you can tell, was it all written by one scribe, or do you detect more than one scribe?
So probably originally it was written by one scribe. However, I have found multiple emendations to the text. So multiple other hands came afterward and either corrected the text, changed the text. Maybe corrected is not the right word, but changed the text. And other hands, exactly. And other hands, they put some annotations, either a prayer, like I found 2 prayers
that's very
on the side. Yes, I really like it. On the side of on the margin of the folio, yes, and other ones, they try to put their own interpretation of the reading. So in one case, I remember having 2 similar words beside each other. So a later hand came and added shadde and a fatha to it, and like a kasra to the other one, something like that. Actually, in chapter 3,
to help the imagined reader along. Yeah,
exactly, the pronunciation. In chapter 3, I think verse 31, it says, لِيَغْفِرَ اللَّهُ يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهُ وَيَغْفِرَ لَكُمُ, and that's it. In the current text we have, يَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُم. So God will forgive you versus forgive your sins. Or forgive for you your sins. And I saw a later hand came, and we see a later hand came with either a pencil or a pen, just wrote on the margin dhunubakum. It's like, well, I don't like the text as it is. It has to have dhunubakum, so I'm adding dhunubakum to it. So it is one hand, probably initially, but then after that, so many different hands were added. And we should not forget that we have at least 6 folios from the beginning of the manuscript were missing, and probably because they are in the beginning, they were torn away, but they were added. They were replaced by other folios, but at a much later time.
More recent, right?
The rosettes, the way that the markers between the verses are different. The script is different. Everything is there. It's very obvious to tell that this is not the original folios.
Okay. And then another nerdy question about the manuscript itself. The original scribe. You alluded to the earlier belief that this is a 1st century Hijri, of course, in the Islamic calendar, 1st century manuscript. But I think you said it in a way which suggests actually, or we know now, it may actually be later. Is that right?
Yes, I don't think we have good evidence to say it's a 1st century manuscript. I am exploring this in chapter 3 of the book, and the way that I start thinking about it is like there's really you cannot just go to the first page of a manuscript and says it was written on the year such and such, right? Sometimes you find it, you find that dating, but this one is not dated. And you don't have an endowment that say like really written by such and such on such and such date. And I wish we can find that to make our lives much easier when it comes to dating manuscripts. The other one would be using some technology to do that, but that was not available. So what I did is I collected all the pieces of evidence I was able to find, which included things like the paleography, the codicology, how compared it to some of the 1st century manuscripts.
Wow.
And
looked just into. Explain. Sorry, I keep jumping in. Forgive me.
No,
just
okay.
Because I'm always attentive to folks who may not know these terms. So, as far as I understand,
that's right.
By paleography, you might mean like the letter shapes. So paleography has to do with the writings. So the letter shapes used, or even the angle of the kind of the words. And then you would compare that to what we know through other studies of when that kind of letter shape was kind of in fashion.
Exactly.
And
was
by
used.
codicology, it would be something more like,
The
such and such
structure of the book.
yeah, like such and such a size of parchment
Yeah.
was used at this specific time. Maybe the manner of sewing together the parchment. Is that right for paleography and codicology?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's right. And all those things do actually point toward a specific time range, right? De Roche has done extensive work on that, and we
Francois
owe that
Deroche,
to
right? Yeah.
Francois de Roche, exactly. And I had the privilege of sitting under him during my PhD course. And so using all these small pieces of evidence from here and there, from how the words are written, sometimes some variants, how they develop, I came to conclude that this manuscript cannot be a first century manuscript. I put it at the earliest would be 750 CE, so that would be at the beginning of the early stages of the Abbasid Caliphate. So they started 750. So as the early stages there, during a time which still the Umayyads arts and the way developing they did manuscripts, they were still existing and they were still influential, but still it was more toward the Abbasid time.
I mean,
So
that's a big deal, right? Because as you described in the earlier accounts, like you told the story of the imam, you saw a video of an imam, or just your own story. I mean, did people say like, Dr. Halaseh, no, you've become a myth buster or something. Why are you doing this to us? We love this tradition about this manuscript. Did anyone say like, it can't be second century? Did you have pushback about that?
Yeah, recently I had a conversation with very unpleasant conversation with a friend who argued that this cannot be a second century manuscript. So I asked him why is not. He said because it's the original Quran, so it has to be the first century. I was like, that does not make sense, right? And it's easy, really, Dr. Gabriel. It's easy to say that, well, this is the first century, second century, third century. Anybody can say a date. But if you don't present an argument for why you are saying it's a first century or second century, really, it's your word against mine. But what I'm doing here is I'm presenting an argument which I think it's
bring your burhan.
exactly احضروا برهانكم فجيب البرهان تبعك, bring your burhan and your evidence and let's compare evidence. But no, I don't think by any means, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful or offensive to my friends that they believe that it's a first century. But after all, we are scientists, we are scholars, we are full of the evidence.
You didn't go write a PhD at St. Andrews or do a postdoc at Harvard because you wanted to get involved in some debate online or with a friend.
Exactly.
This is where the evidence led, and so in terms of the it's tough to discuss this in a podcast, right? But especially because we just have to keep in mind not all the viewers will even know Arabic or read Arabic.
True.
But in terms of the sorts of readings or differences you found in this manuscript vis-a-vis what folks may know from the commonly printed Quran today. Could you maybe give like an example of the kinds of differences you find there in your manuscript?
Absolutely. I would love that. Now, let me, since you mentioned that not everybody is really aware of this field in particular, so it might be important for me to point out that when we say masahif, usually when today we say we are reading in the mushaf, we are reading in the book. I don't have a Quran here in front of me, but we are reading in this particular book. And now not all the, and really, when we say Quran is not very accurate, we should say masahif about the book. So not all the masahif or not all the Qur'ans out there are the same. We have so many different versions of it, but the most common one that people often use, at least in the Levant, in the Arab Peninsula, is the Hafs an Asim. So the reader of Asim, or the reader Asim and his Rawi Hafs, so we say Hafs an Asim. And that became kind of the standard Quran where everybody, or Mushaf, where everybody point to when we talk about the Masahif. So I use that particular one, Hafs an Asim, the most famous by far among all the different versions of the Quran. I used it as the base of my comparison to the manuscript. And as I mentioned, I documented all the variants, even those that they agree with Hafs and Asim, but I only had in the book the ones that deviated or differed from Hafs and Asim. So I had about 309, I think, 309 different qira'ah that does not belong to Hafs and Asim. And actually, I documented more than about 2,483 orthographic difference. So let me, and if you don't mind, let me explain those two things: the 300 variants or 309 variants versus 2,483 orthographic variants. So the reading variant, it can be, it has something to do with either the short vowel, the consonant. So it's basically the same word, but either pronounced differently or has a ta instead of a ya, or ya instead of a ta, something
So
like
you'd be
that,
able
right?
to
So those
hear,
are
you would be able to hear the difference
to
in
hear
that
them.
case, right?
Exactly. You will be able to hear. Now, the orthographic difference, those are things that you see, but you don't hear them. So, for example, we have qala and qul, or it could be qala and qala, but one is written with an alif, one written without an alif.
That medial or middle aleph could not be written, but you
Exactly.
pronounce, it's understood, you pronounce the word in the same way.
Exactly. So even when people today come to you and they say, well, all the masahif that we have today, they are exactly identical to what, let's say, Uthman had, which, that does not fit with the manuscript evidence by any stretch of imagination, because there are differences, even if we are only talking about orthographic differences. Now, you mentioned what are some of those variants, and the ones that I like the most are the ones that I found at the early stages of my PhD, and they became kind of, I feel they are became kind of my companions here, right? It's like my kids, and they continued with me through the days of my PhD. For example, two that I found is in chapter 3, verse 133, we have a waw inserted before the word sari'u, so later inserted. So it reads in Hafs and Asim wasari'u, while the Medina Codex and the Syrian Codex, actually, they say sari'u without the waw. So this is not only a difference according to codices, regional codices, but also according to different reading. And that particular variant, it shows that there was an intentional effort to align the text. Obviously, this variant with many other variants. I came to conclude that those variants show that there was an intentional effort to align the text of the manuscript with either a specific manuscript or a reading tradition.
Yes.
Another interesting variant I found in chapter 89, verse 25, where Hafs and Asim read, فَيَوْمَئِذٍ لَا يُعَذِّبُ عَذَابَهُ أَحَدٌ. At that day, no or none will chastise as he chastises, while the Topkapi manuscript reads, فَيَوْمَئِذٍ لَا يُعَذَّبُ عَذَابُهُ أَحَدٌ. That day none shall be chastised as him, as the unbeliever. And the reading found in the Topkapi, which has been reported by both Yaqub al-Hadrami and Ibn Kathir, it shifts the focus from the uniqueness of God's punishment to emphasize the severity of the punishment that the sinner will endure on the day of judgment. Now, both of those qira'at are considered to be canonical, but that's the beauty of reading or studying Quranic manuscript, is that you are not only limited to what today is known as canonical reading, right? You in the Topkapi, I found many qira'at that today we consider them non-canonical, and even others that do not seem to have been attested or reported in any of the known qira'at literature. And that was like surprising to me.
Yes, it's extraordinary. Now, I mean, just to clarify, I mean, the way I organize this question in my brain usually is really to distinguish between kind of a more archaic level of difference, where you have the tradition of the companion codices and you have the tradition of the different codices sent out by Uthman? So those are kind of two separate questions, but both of those two questions are kind of first level archaic questions. And so you mentioned some of those. And then just when it comes to Hafs an Asim, this term which you've been describing, that's kind of a second level or second layer question because,
That's right.
as you discuss in your book in detail and in very clear terms, Islamic tradition, especially, I guess, in the 10th century around Ibn Mujahid, but there are many other figures, they sort of, come to this conviction that, if we just go with the Uthmanic text type, there's still lots of variation because the Uthmanic text type doesn't disambiguate even consonants, let alone all of the vowels and, the silent mark and all that. Therefore, there are different legitimate ways, and so you're using this word canonical. So these are kind of the legitimate, sort of authorized ways of reading the Uthmanic text type. So even if you agree on kind of the first level, at the second level, there are these. Now, I want to ask a question about these, the second level question. So what people often refer to when they use the word qira'at, that there are 7 of these, later there's 10, but they say there's 7 qira'at, and, so Hafs an Asim sort of represents one of these. This is sometimes defended with the idea that there are 7 ahruf, and I think there's a hadith. Maybe Ibn Mujahid never actually cites it or justify. I don't know. Maybe that's not important. But could you just speak to that? Like online, people will find a lot. Yeah. There's 7 qira'at, but this is just what the Prophet himself said, that the Quran has been written in 7 ahruf, meaning mode or letters.
Yeah. So defining what ahruf is really the $1 million question, right? But let me go back into how this whole idea developed. So one time, Umar ibn Khattab was or heard one of the companions reading a surah, and he was reading it according to hadith على غير ما علمني إياه رسول الله, in a way that differs from how the Prophet taught me. So that the hadith says that he grabbed him from his clothes and took him to the Prophet, and the Prophet heard both recitations, and he said, "You are both correct. The Quran nazala ala sab'ati ahruf. The Quran was revealed on 7 ahruf." Now, what does ahruf mean? Well, there are, I think At-Tabari presented 21 different explanation what the word ahruf means. It can mean an edge, it can be a letter, it can be a mode. And then this was taken when Ibn Mujahid did his work, and he chose those 7 traditions. People start saying that, or later people actually, and people today, they say those 7 of Ibn Mujahid are the 7 ahruf that actually the Prophet permitted and gave, which is sadly, I just read on paper. Well, probably last year. I read the paper last year. That actually made that argument that it's the same, which is sad because those are 2 different things. We cannot put them together. Those are not the ahruf. Now, some people, they say all the 7 ahruf are included in Mus'haf Uthman that he collected and disseminated to other cities. Others, they say this Mus'haf Uthman is only 1 out of the 7, and the 6 others had been burned. So, but all that say, just to give background, how we end up into this number 7. And so Ibn Mujahid, he said those are the 7 canonical ones, but it did not even stop at the 7, right? So he did his work, then Shatibi afterward, and then Dani, they did more work on that, to say that they chose 2 rawis from each one of those 7 readers. So you have the reader, for example, let's say Hafs, right? So Ibn Mujahid, he said those are the readings that Hafs read with, and he mentioned multiple people that he called them rawis. Then Dani and Shatibi, they came and they choose 2 out of all those, right? Then, so at that point, with the time of Shatibi, we had 1 reader with 2 rawis, Then Ibn al-Jazari, later on, he came and added the 3 to the 7. So now we have the 10 canonical readings. So we say we have the 7 canonical readings. People say we have 10, and those are the most recognized ones. Now Ad-Dimyati, I think after a while, he added 4 more, but they never received the same recognition as all the other, or the 10 other readings. That's why I think this is one important thing I would like to mention, that when we talk about the transmission of the Quran, we really need to stop to talking about this linear, straight, static, perfect transmission from point 1 to point B with no interruption or no development whatsoever. We need to talk about not the canonization of the Quran, but the canonization stages of the Quran, because it's multiple stages. I know Shadi Nasser has, in his book, has put at least five stages for those canonizations, starting with Uthman, then Ibn Mujahid, then Ad-Dani, what's his name? Ad-Dani and Shatibi, then Ibn al-Jazari, then he goes into the 1924 Quran. So that's what's really important, that the transmission and the development of the Quranic text is unlike what we often think of, this pure, uninterrupted, not touched.
Yes.
There was so many factors.
It's a much more interesting story. It's a much more interesting,
much more complicated. There were so many factors played into developing and shaping and transmitting the Quranic text as we know it today. That includes personal preferences, scribal errors, like so many different ways or factors affected this text.
Now, something I really want to emphasize here for folks who may not know much about this whole story is that, we were mentioning earlier the efforts of different figures. You mentioned Al-Hajjaj to eliminate other text types. Okay, I just want to be clear here, under your correction if I say something wrong here, Dr. Dami, but that is a completely separate question from these readings. So by text types, the Islamic community, more or less, says there's only one legitimate text type, the text type of Uthman, and there are these stories of actual suppression, even sort of persecution or punishment of people who read from other text types. However, when it comes to the readings, as you're saying, the story you're telling us,
that's right,
Ibn Mujahid and Shatibi and Dani and others, and the 7 and then the 10, those readings at a certain point, I think that's part of Ibn Mujahid's project, they're all recognized as God's word. So you can, again, correct me if I get something wrong here, but it's good to read them, to seek guidance from them, and even to pray according to this or that reading. It's all valid. And so, if you ask someone before the printing of the 1924 Cairo text, just an average person, in different places, there might be a different reading being used, and, that's totally fine. It's not a problem. And I wonder if you think, basically with, polemics, apologetics, or just the presence of the printed Cairo text, that, there's some confusion now. There's this idea that, no, only this version is okay, whereas for centuries, Muslims said that many readings are all okay.
Yeah, so there are multiple things I would like to comment on this one. And first of all, yes, you are right. When we're talking about the Qira'at, we are talking about primarily the Uthmanic text type. Those are the 10, what we have today is the 10 readings that they are all considered to be God's word in Islamic theology, Kalamullah, right? It was all inspired by God. They are all good for prayers, good for rituals, and you can recite them with no problem whatsoever. Now, some regions in the Middle East, North Africa, some regions, they use different qira'at. So some use Hafs an Asim, other use Susi, other use Duri. So there are, until today, people do use different ones, but often when it comes, especially in apologetics, in Muslim apologetics circles, when they talk about the Quran, especially to lay people, they often point out, they say one Quran and they point out to Hafs an Asim. Even this is not the case. Not only Hafs an Asim, there are other ones and there are differences. Now, the reason for these differences and how we justify those differences, it's a whole different question. But we have to acknowledge that there are differences. And not only that, I point out in the book that attributing the qira'ah to one of the eponymous readers is not enough to call it canonical, because it has not only to be attributed to the eponymous reader, but it has also to be attributed to or transmitted through one of the two rawis that a Shatibi justified for that. So you will have readings that they were read by eponymous reader. For example, Ibn Amir. That's one of the readings I found in the Topkapi Manuscript. It's reported to have been read by Ibn Amir, but because it's not transmitted through one of his rawis, it's not canonical. So, Dr. Gabriel, the way I think about it is that there were multiple stages of, if you wish, to refine the Quranic text, or to choose from the oral body of literature that was circulating among people. Because as we know, that the Quran is started as an oral text, and over time it was trimmed and it was edited in a way that we ended up with what we have today. So we have readings that we know that the Prophet read, but today they are considered non-canonical. Other readings that the Prophet and Ibn Mas'ud read, and they are non-canonical, right? So, for example, أعطيناك الكوثر versus أنطيناك الكوثر, right? Then, so first you have things that the Prophet read that they did not pass one level of kind of verification. Then you have other readings that some of those eponymous readers have read, but they're not considered to be canonical. So the point of, I don't discuss the concept of Kalamullah in my work, and I don't think that textual critics.
Logical question kind of behind all this. I mean,
Exactly.
You do this very meticulous analysis of the evidence we have in the manuscript, but absolutely, there, is the speech of God actually the meaning, the mana? Is it the articulation, the lafz?
Yeah.
If it's the articulation, can different articulations all be kalam Allah? The really interesting theological points.
It's there's a lot to be said, and even those just to say that even those eponymous readers, they use their own judgment in choosing which reading they will transmit. For example, Hafs an Asim, even that he's an Iraqi reader, he reads chapter 43, verse 71 as Tashtahihi, which is the reading that's found, or the lesson that's found in the Medinan Codex, while his other reader, Shu'ba, he reads Tashtahi. So those are two different ones from the same eponymous reader by two different rawi. So the concept of development and transmission of the Quranic text is really very, very rich, very complicated, and we have to stop as scholars, and even students and people who are interested in this field, we should stop talking about one straight linear development and start thinking about all the factors that played role in developing this text.
So one last question that brings us back to the Topkapi manuscript. As you describe in the introduction to the book, the manuscript now is in a museum, actually in Istanbul. You speak a little bit about kind of the actual history of the physical object. So could you say a word or two about that? I mean, if it was actually written down by a scribe in the early second Islamic century, there was no Istanbul at the time. It was only Constantinople. Right. So how did this manuscript end up in Istanbul?
Yeah, so that's one of the new findings that I have documented in my book. I started looking into different sources of that talks about manuscripts in general, Qur'an manuscripts in general, right? And I start seeing a thread of some talk in so many different sources about this manuscript that came from Iraq to Cairo and stayed in Cairo for a while. Then it was taken from Cairo to today's Istanbul, right? And the more I studied in that, this is what I found. And I get excited really about this particular aspect of it. So this is what I found. I found that really most of the readers that. So let me just go one step behind, if you don't mind. What I found that the Topkapi manuscript does not represent one reading tradition. Like all Quran manuscripts from the first 2-3 Islamic centuries, they do not represent the reading of Hafs and Asim or the reading of Asim even. It's just it's a collection of so many different readings that you find. You find readings that's unique to Nafi', or some that's unique to Hafs, and some that's unique to this or that, right? So it's a collection of different readings that came together. But there is a prominent taste and flavor of the manuscript that is Iraqi flavor. You see, even especially when it comes to the emendation of the manuscript that I mentioned in chapter 4, you will see that there is a continuous attempt to align the text of the manuscript with the Iraqi codices and the Iraqi readings as well. So when I start thinking about that and reading about this manuscript that actually came from Iraq, right, and came to Egypt and how they treated it in Egypt, and in one source they say that they believed first that it was Uthman's manuscript. They believed that there were stains, and they saw stains of blood on this manuscript, that they believed it's Uthman's blood, and it was taken from Cairo to Istanbul. And when I researched all the famous Quran manuscripts, I did not find any of them that really match this criteria, except this history, except the Topkapi manuscript. So that's how it ended up in Istanbul. Really, the museum in Istanbul is doing a magnificent job in protecting it, to the point that they don't even put it out to the public except in a few days in Ramadan. And what people usually go and take pictures with is just a facsimile edition. But they were like really gracious in allowing us to research it, allowing me to research it. They were very helpful in going back and forth. And that's why I think it's really important to study Quran manuscripts, because I know we usually talk about the oral tradition, the oral transmission of the Quran, and maybe that needs a whole different interview for another episode, right? Another episode, exactly. But Quran manuscripts and manuscripts in general, they give us things and evidence that either verify our history or corrects our history. So after studying this manuscript, I reached to the point where if one adheres to the traditional, or if you would say the standard Islamic belief that often being taught today, that the Quran has been preserved perfectly, letter by letter, dot by dot, and even haraka by haraka since the time of Prophet, then I think the academic historical analysis of this manuscript and the development and transmission of the Quranic text in other manuscripts will indeed be problematic to this approach. And the assumption that the Quranic text remained static, fixed, and absolutely unchanged from the time of the Prophet until today is at best problematic. And the claim cannot be supported historically or academically or through any manuscript evidence.
So allow me really to encourage all viewers to, well, first of all, to like this episode and subscribe to this channel. But, go ahead and take the next step. If you're interested in Quran manuscripts, there's no better way to sort of go next level with this than by buying and reading Dr. Halaseh's work. Again, it's the Topkapi Qur'an Manuscript, HS32, History, Text, and Variants. There will be links down below in the description that will take you right to the websites where you can purchase it. And it's a really extraordinarily meticulous work. He shows you step by step. First he presents all of the key details about the manuscript. He presents the theory behind manuscript study, and then he takes you through all the particularities of this particular manuscript. So it's a wonderful way to go deeper in the study of Quranic manuscripts. Dr. Halaseh, thank you so much for being with me on Exploring the Qur'an and the Bible.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Dr. Gabriel. Appreciate it.